how did Large Igneous Provinces change global climate so rapidly? So before starting, I want to share with you the origin of this picture. That is a wonderful columnar jointed basalt from Suðuroy Island, the southernmost of Faroe Islands, and you will see other of these pictures later during the talk. So first of all, we have to introduce Large Igneous Provinces. Large Igneous Provinces are exceptional magmatic events occurring throughout Earth's history. And as you can see from this map, they are spread all over the world in different geological contexts. The red ones are the so-called continental flat basalts, the most common ones, the basaltic ones. Then there are those marked in blue. These are set in oceanic context, so slightly different. And then there are some, but they are quite rare, yellow ones that are the silicic ones. So they are not basaltic. They have slightly different composition. But in general, what we can say is that Large Igneous Provinces have involved huge magma volumes up to million cubic kilometers, and they occur roughly every 20 million years in Earth's record. It's interesting then to notice their distribution not only in terms of space, but of time as well. Because during the Phanerozoic, the last 540 million years of Earth's history, we see that they coincided roughly with max extinction events. So all of them coincided with severe climatic and environmental catastrophes, and many of them coincided with biotic turnovers as well. During our presentation tonight, we are going to talk about the North Atlantic Igneous Province. This occurred 55 million years ago, its peak activity, but it started already about 62 million years ago. And then I will briefly mention other two Large Igneous Provinces from previous projects. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, 201 million years ago. This is coinciding with the End-Triassic max extinction event. And the Deccan Troughs occurred 66 million years ago. This was synchronous with the Cretaceous mass extinction. And so most of you know, of course, that this event coincided with the disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs. Well, now I think that most of you are now wondering what's the link between Large Igneous Provinces and mass extinction events. Well, Large Igneous Provinces and climatic environmental catastrophes are linked by greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon species, especially carbon dioxide and methane, are the main greenhouse gases released from Large Igneous Province activity. And the injection of huge amount of carbon species into the surface system, so atmosphere plus hydrosphere, has severe impact on Earth's surface and biota as well. In particular, carbon species into the atmosphere may cause a greenhouse effect with global warming. Similarly, carbon species into the hydrosphere may lead to the pH lowering with ocean acidification. And combining all these effects, we have global scale climatic environmental changes that in some cases may even lead to biotic turnovers. But now let's start focusing on the protagonist of this story tonight, the North Atlantic Igneous Province. This province is among the largest Large Igneous Provinces. It's involving more than 1 million cubic kilometer in volume, so a lot of magmas was intruded 55 million years ago, and extends from Greenland to Scandinavian Peninsula and British Isles. And what's interesting now is to notice that the emplacement and the peak activity of the North Atlantic Igneous Province coincided with the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the so-called PETM. This is an event occurred 55.9 million years ago, corresponding to a global scale temperature increase of 5 up to 8 Celsius degrees. This is the highest, the other way around, the highest temperature increase over the Cenozoic in the last 65 million years, but actually is the highest in the last 100 million years. And corresponding to this increase in temperature, there was, of course, the global carbon cycle disruption, as evidenced by the sedimentary record with the carbon isotopic excursion. And this disruption resulted from thousands of petagrams of carbon released into the surface system in less than 20,000 years. These 20,000 years may appear like a huge amount of time for human scale, but it's actually a very short amount of time in geological scale. For those who are not familiar with this prefix P standing for petagrams, it stands for 10 to the power of 15. So it means really huge amount of carbon. But now we can start going in detail in tonight's talk. This is structured in 3 different chapters. The first one, about the Porcline project, can be summarized as, can we find the record of the PETM magmatic pools? Then the second one is about the Seaforth project, and this can be summarized as, can we characterize the PETM greenhouse gas emissions? And then the third and last chapter is about the Impulse project. So is the Iceland plume still pulsing? For starting with the first chapter, I leave space to Hazel.
Swap around the microphone in a really untechnical manner. Perfect. So, well, thank you, Manfredo. So this, is the first bit we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, can we find the record of this PETM pulse? And I guess to quote everyone's kind of favorite secondary school science phrase, right? Correlation is not causation, right? Just because these 2 things happen at the same time, if we want to be able to say sentences like the North Atlantic Igneous Province caused the PETM or supplied the carbon for the PETM, we need to understand the mechanism by which these 2 events are linked and be able to kind of in some capacity model the carbon emissions. We need to be able to create a model that reproduces a way this igneous province could have released the correct greenhouse gases to drive the climate change. And so to think about that, we're firstly going to think about how large igneous provinces form. So the most widely accepted model and mechanism for LIP formation is mantle plumes. So in the Earth's mantle, there are these large-scale convection cells. At points, columns of hot material rise where it's heated from the bottom, and these are called mantle plumes. And when they first reach the top of the surface, they deliver a lot of hot material. This causes a lot of melting, you get a lot of magma, a lot of eruptions, you form a large igneous province. And so this model, you kind of end up with something like this, right? So you've got a very hot mantle plume rising from some depth within the Earth up to the surface, the base of the lithosphere. At this point, a lot of melting occurs, a lot of magma is generated, and this can either be intruded as sills and kind of intrusive igneous rocks, or sometimes it's erupted in big volcanoes and fissures, and these volcanoes release a lot of gas, and this gas has a lot of carbon in it, right? Lots of greenhouse gases. This can drive climate change. And this is, I guess, the widely accepted model of this. But if we look kind of more specifically at the 2 events we're looking at, we can see that there's a slight issue or something that needs to be resolved between the timescale of these 2 things. So if we look at the North Atlantic Igneous Province, right, this happened on around 7.5 million years. Whereas then if we look at the PETM on this side, right, it's an order of magnitude slower at 200,000 years. And that 200,000 years is the entire PETM. So that's the rapid increase in temperature and also the time it took to this to recover, to go back towards normal temperature. So the actual rapid temperature change, the bit we think the gases are being released, is even smaller than that, around 20,000 years. So we can see already there's a massive difference between 7.5 million and 20,000. And in fact, if we zoom out even more, the Iceland mantle plume itself is an ongoing system, right? It is currently causing these lovely volcanic eruptions that seem to never happen when I'm there. And so, we've got the scale all the way back from 62 million years to today. So to understand this, we need some mechanism by which this larger and deep Earth slow process that's generating the igneous provinces can cause the rapid climate change. And so this is, right, the central question of our talk today. We're thinking about how can we reconcile these 2 timescales with each other, and how can we understand how something so slow is causing something so fast, geologically fast. I agree, 20,000 years is not real world fast. And to do that, we're going to look a bit more about what's actually going on inside a mantle plume. So for this, I've just got a little model here. I'm going to play it through a couple of times so we can see everything. But what happens here is we heat some material at the bottom, and what rises up is a mantle plume, right? You get this plume structure where it's rising up. At the top, it has this kind of mushroom-shaped region, known as the head, and below it's the long bit, which is the tail. And when this impacts the top of the model or the base of the lithosphere, right, it spreads out. But if we look down at the base of the model, when it develops, you can see that there are other features going on. And in fact, at certain points, there are more pulses of hot material rising very rapidly in this system. So if we look kind of just now, there one goes up, it will keep running through so you can try and spot them at the bottom. But you can see that this, once the plume system has developed, we've got these kind of pulses. Let's be ready. There we go. And these spread out, they go up the tail of it, and then they spread out radially throughout the head region of the plume. So from, I guess, physics standpoint, right, why is this happening? Well, this kind of blobby nature is a feature of convection systems when it's very high viscosity material, or high radium. So if we think about something we might all know, a lava lamp, right? These are very similarly, very gloopy, viscous things. You heat it from the bottom, all of that material doesn't rise at once, right? Instead, you get these blobs of hot material that rise and circle up within it. So from a physics standpoint, this makes, nice, perfect sense that the plumes would also be blobbing and pulsing. But how would this drive the rapid emissions? Well, it kind of makes some sense already. If you look at the speed these little pulses are going up there, they're definitely going a lot faster than the whole plume is developed. But also, if we look a bit more at what's going on in the North Atlantic, the rapid melting actually occurs when one of these pulses passes underneath this thin bit of crust, right? So as the start of the pulse, the front edge of it passes suddenly where the crust is thinner, there's less pressure there, so you undergo decompression melting. So Steve's favorite analogy for this is to think about it like boxes on a conveyor belt. So the long-term conveyor belt system, right, is kind of like the plume system. It maybe takes a while to set up, you've got to build a conveyor belt, but once you've built a conveyor belt, you can transport boxes really quite fast along it. And if you were to look down on the conveyor belt from above, it's kind of a bird's eye view of it, the edge of a box would arrive at you very rapidly, because they're very packaged and contained things. So if you were looking downwards, at one point there would be no box there, and then suddenly there would be the edge of a box in front of you. And the arrival of that edge rapidly, that's what then generates this sudden rapid onset of melting. So we go from no magma to lots of magma to lots of eruptions. And so this is, I guess, kind of the mechanism by which we're going to argue that large igneous provinces, despite their overall long durations, can, in peaks and pulses, generate rapid emissions. So this is all well and good, right? But how do we measure this 55 million years ago? How do we take the temperature of something that happened 55 million years ago? Well, luckily for us, this is possible because mantle temperature can be directly interpreted from oceanic crustal thickness. I'm going to go through what that actually means. So at a mid-ocean ridge, right, we're generating new oceanic crust. So as the two plates spread apart, material melts, and it's this melt that solidifies to form the new oceanic crust. So if you melt this much material, you've only got this much material that can then solidify to form oceanic crust. So your crust is this thickness, just a factor of how much melts. So what happens if one of these hot pulses arrives? Well, we can all kind of guess from very basic science that if it's hotter, you're going to melt more things, right? We take a candle or a flamethrower to some ice, we're going to melt a different amount of ice. And if we have suddenly this much material melting instead, this will solidify to form much thicker crust. And so that forms this almost ridge of crust, right? Where as the crust is developing through time, when it's hotter, more melted, it's solidified to form thicker crust. And what happens after this pulse? Well, if we return back to our normal temperature, cooler mantle, right? Then we get thinner crust again, because again, it was colder, there was less melting, less material melted to solidify the oceanic crust. And so this way, these pulses of increasingly hot, these thermal pulses in the mantle, can be recorded as these ridges of thicker crust, where it goes from cold to hot to cold, and thin to thick to thin again. And so obviously we're thinking about this in terms of oceanic crust, but we can also think about the same thing in the amount of magma it generates, right? If you've got more melting, you develop more magma, you can have more volcanoes, you can have more gas emissions. So this same process, right, is how we can understand what the amount of activity, the magma productivity going on in the igneous province. And so by measuring the thickness of this oceanic crust, it allows us to measure the temperature of these thermal pulses through time. And so the logical question from this is, can we see, right, can we find the ridge that relates to this thermal pulse we're saying drove the PETM 55 million years ago? And it probably won't surprise you, given that I'm giving this talk, that we think we can. And so we believe this is this feature known as Eridor Ridge, which is kind of just offshore island today. And this map on the far side over here, this star shows where Eridor Ridge is, and this is at the time the igneous province was forming. You can see it's right on the edge of it. So it's on the very far edge of it. And if you see from this map, right, there seems to be an elongated ridge that could well be thickened crust. And on top of it are all these little dots. So these red dots are our seafloor instruments. So in 2021, we took the RV Celtic Explorer out here, the Irish research ship. We deployed 27 ocean bottom instruments and collected a data set across there. And that's what we're looking at here. This is seismic data along that line shown on the map. And so the first feature you probably notice is Eridor Ridge, right? This nice pointy bit labeled. And so the main thing we might notice from this is it's not one single peak, right? It's got two pointy bits. got two towers. Steve likes to describe it as a molar, which I find quite unpleasant, but that's the shape it is. And the other feature that you might immediately notice, right, is there's another very tall feature on this edge, which is labeled Gondor Seamount. Now, I don't want to be mean to a volcano. I feel quite bad, but actually, we don't really like this volcano because it's in the way. So this isn't a volcano or a feature that formed as this oceanic crust was being generated. Instead, it's a later volcano that formed on top of the oceanic crust that was already there. So if we measure the thickness of it, we're not actually measuring the temperature or the thickness when the oceanic crust was generated. This is later stuff that has happened on top of it. It kind of gets in the way of looking at our record. So we just have to sort of ignore that. And then by using the magnetic stripes in the ocean, we can work out the age of all of this. And this shows us from that modeling that the PTM occurred here. So you can see that is not quite in line with Eridor Ridge, right? Eridor Ridge is slightly younger. And the reason for this is exactly what we expect, is because I showed on that map, right, we're right at the edge of the igneous province. So most of the volcanoes, the intrusions, and most of the gas was generated in the center of the province. And that would have happened a bit before Eridor Ridge formed because it takes time for these pulses to spread out. So we're looking right on the edge of it. So we would expect it to be a slightly different age. And so this does confirm that Eridor Ridge looks like the correct time for the PETM pulse. And if you look at all these black dots on here, these show the top of the oceanic crust. And even if we just glance at the top, we can see that this side, the older side, there seems to be less of it, right? It's down here and quite flat, and then it goes up to kind of Eridor where it looks the most. But obviously, we're only seeing the top of the oceanic crust here. And if you actually want to measure how thick something is, we need to see the top and bottom of it. So for that, we use a slightly different type of seismic data. It's a bit less directly interpretable. We have to do lots of different modeling. So we've used lots of different modeling techniques and kind of programs to end up with some models, and this is one of them, which shows, so you can see, so the top of the crust is kind of where that yellow bit starts, and then the bottom is the edge of that orange one. And so, again, we're just going to have to ignore Gondor, pretend it doesn't exist. And then if we look at our models, we can see that long term, from this side, the old, going that way to the younger, that crustal thickness increases till it's the thickest, right? That distance is getting wider until it's the thickest at Eridor Ridge, and then it gets thinner afterwards. And so this is kind of what we would expect, right? If we're setting up one of these mantle plume systems. If we remember the model, firstly, the plume rises up, and if you're suddenly got the arrival of a mantle plume, temperature will slowly increase. It also makes sense, and you'd expect the hottest bit to be at the time of the igneous province and the climate change, right? That's most melting, and then it gets cooler afterwards. But if we look, I guess, a bit more closely at this, we can also see that superimposed on top of this, there are also peaks and pulse in it, right? It's not a straight record. We've got these areas where the crust gets thicker and then thinner, Eridor Ridge being the biggest one of these, right? And so these are the plume pulses, right? We've recorded thickness and temperature. We've recorded changes in thickness, which correlate to these changes in temperature that we were talking about within the mantle plume structure. And so we can see this record of plume pulsing occurring at the time of the PETM, and this PETM pulse being the biggest one in our record. And so this means that we now have a record of crustal thickness throughout time and across this whole process, which is a record of mantle temperature across this process. So we can now model, in some way, we can model the amount of magma productivity, the amount of melt and magma that was generated across the igneous province. And so that can help us then model how much emissions it would have produced. But another factor is needed to really do this modeling, and that's think about how fast this pulse was moving. If we're talking about whether this igneous province can cause very rapid climate change, we need to know if it could make kind of rapid emissions. Obviously, if this pulse moves very slowly, even if it produces enough gas, if it's really spread out, you're not going to get the rapid peak that the PETM was. And so to do that, we need to zoom in a bit more on Eridor. So here is its two peaks, and again, where it is on the map. And luckily for us, Eridor Ridge is not the only place that we've seen this pulse. So it's probably the only record we've got from oceanic crustal thickness. But we can also see in some sedimentary basins up in the North Sea, there's also a record of this pulsing, because as this hot material passed under these sedimentary basins, it caused increased dynamic support, it caused uplift. So the hot pulse went under, the material got all lifted up, and the erosion that results in that is recorded in these sedimentary rocks. And we can see this in several basins up here from lots of different studies. And you can see, right, both of these studies are really showing one peak of uplift. But increasingly more modern studies where we're using more high resolution data, we've got better seismic data, and we've also got better biostratigraphic constraints on this, they're actually beginning to show records of two pulses, right? Which fit very well with the two peaks we've got of Eriador. So by having this record, we know the age of this pulse in two separate locations. And this means we can work out how fast it traveled, right? We know at what time it was here, and we know at what time it was here. So remember, these pulses kind of spread out radially in the plume head. It's like if you throw a stone in the water, you get the circles that spread out from it. And then using basic speed equals distance over time, right? We can work out how long it took to travel from there to there and work out how fast this is traveling. And so this speed of the pulse is known as the plume flux. This is the parameter we use to talk about this rate. And why is that really important? Well, previous modeling that Steve underdid and published in 2019 has shown that the carbon emissions from this vary significantly depending on what plume flux you use. So this is a graph that shows the emissions of carbon in petrograms of carbon per year, so how much carbon it's making per year during the PUTM. And this blue line represents the amount of carbon that was needed, or the emissions per year that were needed for the PUTM. And you can see there are two different red curves on top of it. One at the top, which has a fast plume flux, and one at the bottom, which has a slow plume flux. And you can see the slow one, right, isn't producing enough carbon to meet the PUTM. And so what our new modeling has done, and what our new data from here measuring this plume flux with Eriador ridges, is we've been able to rule out these bottom slow scenarios. We know instead of this model was made by kind of taking a range of potential, practical, geologically feasible plume fluxes. But with our modeling, we've been able to measure the actual plume flux, and we can now say, in fact, we're somewhere near the faster ones. And so I guess the question that remains from this is, okay, but how on earth are you going from how much magma there was to how much carbon was coming up? And Manfredo will explain that more in a second. But just to kind of finish this bit off, right? So the answer to the question is, can we find the record of the PUTM magmatic pulse? Is yes, right? We can see the initiation of the plume in this long-term temperature increase, and then we can see multiple pulses superimposed on top of this, the biggest one occurring at the time of the PUTM. And this PUTM pulse has a double peak, which we've seen both in Eriador and it's seen in the sedimentary record of Berry-Shetland Basin. And by finding it in a couple of places, we can measure the time difference it took to travel between these two locations, which constrains our plume flux and therefore allows us to better estimate the emissions from the igneous province. Manfredo.
Yes, thanks, Hazel, for this great part about the first chapter. And now we can move to the second chapter that, as I said before, can be summarized as, can we characterize the PUTM greenhouse gas emissions? Well, I want to start from this graph by Steve et al. 2019, because this is like the starting point of the C-Force project. As Hazel explained, these two curves represent two different scenarios of high or fast plume flux and low or slow plume flux. And we have to understand the actual carbon emissions in order to understand which one of these two scenarios is the more reliable one. So starting from this mechanistic model of carbon emissions, here in Birmingham, the so-called red curve team is based. So the team who is working with the aim to reconstruct the correct forcing function. And this is mainly done in collaboration with the University of Aarhus and Aberdeen. Well, first of all, the aim, as I said, is to reconstruct greenhouse gas emission from the night, from the North Atlantic Igneous Province in terms of carbon species. So carbon speciation is important in order to understand the impact of carbon species in the atmosphere hydrosphere system. Methane and carbon dioxide behave differently in surface system. And then also in terms of amounts of carbon species degassed over time. So we want to provide a spatially and temporally detailed model of carbon emissions. So to do so, we have to reconstruct past gas emissions from rocks. But how can we do that? Well, primary carbon preserved in basaltic rocks is a minimal part compared to the amount of carbon that was degassed during the activity of large igneous provinces. Carbon is degassed via magmatic intrusions and volcanic eruptions, is indeed a volatile element, and differently from water and sulfur species, it exhaled at high pressures, meaning deep in Earth's crust. And this has a important implication because carbon, differently from water and sulfur species, escapes from the magmatic system already deep in Earth's crust. So how can we reconstruct these gas emissions from rocks? and in particular, how can we investigate these carbon emissions that were injected into the surface systems millions of years ago at the time of Large Igneous Provinces? Well, to answer to this question, we need melt and fluid inclusions. These are tiny droplets of fluids and volatile species that were entrapped at the time of Large Igneous Province activity during the crystal growth of magmatic minerals. So they may be described as tiny imperfections in the crystal lattice of magmatic minerals that preserve tiny amounts of the volatiles that were coexisting along with crystals and melts in magmatic systems. And it's also important to understand the multi-scale approach that we use in this type of study. So I will briefly present the results from previous studies from different Large Igneous Provinces, Camp and Deccan. And the scales that we work with span from micrometer to millimeter up to hundreds and thousands of kilometers. So from the scale of hand sample to the scale of Large Igneous Provinces in order to reconstruct the types and amounts of greenhouse gas emissions throughout the igneous provinces. So I show you some examples like carbon dioxide within the bubbles of melt inclusions in Deccan basalts. Similarly, also in the camp, there is carbon dioxide within bubbles of melt inclusions within basalts. And in the camp, we found also another type of inclusions, fluid inclusions, with methane along with water and salts, halite, within microgabbros. Microgabbros are similar to basaltic rocks, but it's cooled more slowly, so giving a more crystalline structure to the rock. And in these types of rock, quartz is usually present, and we found something similar also in the North Atlantic Igneous Province. So from the lesson that we learned from previous Large Igneous Provinces, from previous projects, we reconstructed the magma plumbing system of Large Igneous Provinces based on Camp and Deccan, and we constrained carbon emissions, thermogenic and magmatic emissions. These are two different types of emissions. The magmatic ones are those that directly derive from the degassing of the magmatic system. The thermogenic ones are those induced by the heating and metamorphism of host rocks. So because of the high temperature of the magma intruding host rocks are transformed, releasing volatile elements. So we've been able to constrain thermogenic methane emissions from fluid inclusions with shallow origin and magmatic CO2 emissions from melt inclusions with deep origin. And now we are using the same approach on the North Atlantic Igneous Province in order to reconstruct the greenhouse gas emissions that drove the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. So in order to do so, we started from sampling of two different areas. We wanted to sample both the western and eastern margin of the province. So we focused on Skagerrak intrusion and the overlying lava pile in Greenland for the western margin. And from different formations, Beinsford, Kvanai, Prestfjell, and Malin-Stindor formation from Faroese Island. And these two locations in eastern Greenland and Faroese Islands have been chosen on the base of their paleolocation. 56 million years ago, these two locations were close to each other, roughly in the current position of Iceland, and they were very close to the mantle plume, so to the center of the igneous province. Of course, the rifting occurred after the North Atlantic Igneous Province activity led to the formation and the opening of North Atlantic Ocean. Well, the first step in this type of investigation is the petrographic characterization. So we need to understand the type of materials that we have and to investigate the microstructures within them. In the case of Skagerrak, for instance, for those who are not familiar with Skagerrak intrusion, this is one of the best documented and best studied intrusion, magmatic intrusion. And in this sketch, you can see the structure from the external cores to the internal part. We have a crystallization process with the external parts that crystallize before those at the inner part, and specifically the so-called sandwich horizon that is at the center of the intrusion, slightly moved to the upper part. This corresponds to the last droplets of magma that crystallized. So starting from the external and older, moving to the internal and younger portions of this intrusion, we observe different types of microstructures, different types of inclusions, containing also different types of volatiles. In detail, starting with the granophyric granite that I mentioned from the Sandwich Horizon, we observed the occurrence of quartz in different petrographic sites, so in different positions like subhedral crystals and in interstitial position forming graphic textures with alkali feldspar. And quartz usually contains a lot of inclusions, and these inclusions contain usually carbon dioxide, methane, and water. Then, taking another example of this dataset, we also analyzed the lava flows from the lava pile on top of Skagerrak intrusion. And we found a lot of inclusions within clinopyroxene and olivine. And some of these inclusions, like in the case of these olivine-hosted bubble-bearing melt inclusions, CO2 within them. So this is a preliminary dataset for the Greenland areas. And now we started also investigating the eastern margin of the province, the Faroe Islands side. Here, we carried out a fieldwork this summer in collaboration with Aarhus University, in particular with Christian Tyner and Heirekur Mortensen. And here, we sampled a lot of wonderful rocks, starting from lava flows, like those forming spectacular columnar joints. Then we sampled also volcanic complexes that are quite common in Suðuroy Island, the southernmost island of Faroes. Then we sampled also some dikes and sills. Some of these dikes may be interpreted also like the feeding conduit of the lava flows. Then we sampled tufaceous materials, ash layers, and we also got access to the Jardefengi, that is the Geological Survey of Faroes. And there we got access to drill cores that we managed to sample. So we got access to rocks that otherwise cannot be accessed since not outcropping. Now, just to briefly summarize the conclusions of this second chapter, the Seaforce chapter, we've seen that melt and fluid inclusions in rock samples of Large Igneous Provinces are the remnants of their greenhouse gas emissions. And based on previous studies on Camp and Deccan, we reconstructed the transcrustal magma plumbing system of Large Igneous Provinces that we want to test if applies to the North Atlantic Igneous Province too. We are now applying the same approach based on melt and fluid inclusions for the NIPE, so focusing on its center, these two locations, Faroes and Skagerrak area. And preliminary data show the occurrence of different carbon species. We've seen mainly carbon dioxide and methane that were degassed during the NIPE activity. And now we move to the third and last chapter of this presentation, and I give the stage to Hazel again.
So we figure out microphones. There we go. So this chapter could also be called, it wasn't just Manfredo that had an exciting summer, me and Steve also got to do some fun things. But here we're going to think about asking the question, right, is the Iceland plume still pulsing? So we've mentioned a couple of times throughout this talk that the Iceland plume is an ongoing system, right? There's still a mantle plume under Iceland. It's still affecting their everyday volcanic activity. And so the question is, can we still detect this process? Throughout this talk, we have argued that mantle plume pulsing is this mechanism by which the Large Igneous Provinces can cause rapid climate change, right? How we can link this overall slower process to the more rapid climate change, such as the PUTM. But obviously, for that to stand true, right, we need the plume pulsing hypothesis to be correct, and we need to understand the most we can about it to create the most accurate models. And so Iceland and the ongoing plume provides us with a kind of smoking gun, right? This plume is still here, and so if this process is still ongoing today, we can go there, measure it, and learn more about this hypothesis, which kind of provides the mechanism for all of our modeling 55 million years ago. And so that's the aim of the Impulse project, which aims to take the pulse of the Iceland mantle plume And so this is something we went to see on the Marcus G. Langster, which is an American research vessel, this summer to research. Now, how do we take the pulse of a mantle plume? Even though it's modern, firstly, we're still talking about, millions of years old. And also, you can't just stick a thermometer down into a mantle plume. Once again, we're going to have to rely on the same sort of things we were doing over in Eridor Ridge, right? Still relying on the fact that the thickness of oceanic crust is a record of the mantle temperature. And so as we kind of built up before, right, it forms these ridges of thickened crust. And just south of Iceland, you can really see in the gravity map these ridges in these sort of elongate V-shaped, they're called the V-shaped ridges, that go kind of either side of the mid-ocean ridge here. And so these are thought, or the hypothesis that is most accepted and that we believe in and argue for, is that these formed in the same way, right? As these thermal pulses came up and spread out, they caused more melting, you got thicker oceanic crust. They kind of end up V-shaped because the plume pulse is spreading out radially, right? It's not traveling in a straight line, it's sort of spreading out in all directions. So this causes them to kind of diverge away. And so we went out there summer to try and get some data to kind of study these and to do exactly what we did at Eridor Ridge, but in higher resolution. So we took more instruments and also more kind of fancy equipment to get a much higher resolution data set. And so this picture here on this side, this is the actual path that our ship took. So we traveled out of Iceland, went down here, and you can see we've got kind of two lines that we went along. One which goes perpendicular across the ridges, and one that was more north-south, kind of up, exactly up the mid-ocean ridge. And so this way we've imaged these structures along and up, so we can kind of build up an almost 3D view of what's going on, right? We can study their structure from all sides and kind of build up their theory overall. And this will hopefully help us, and we really think it will help us confirm exactly how they formed. Because although we kind of confidently argue that they're thermal plume pulsing, there are people who think that's not how they formed. And so there are definitely other hypotheses, and also there are features we don't know about them. So by collecting this really good data set, covering them in kind of both directions, we hopefully can address all of these remaining questions. And if we look over here on the other side, we can also see the project a bit more in context. So these yellow boxes are the two regions where our two impulse lines were. We got this summer, but you can see down here in pink at the bottom, this is the Poroclim project. So this is the lines I was showing across Eridor Ridge. And so this way, so oceanic crust, right, it gets younger as you move to the center where the mid-ocean ridge is where new stuff is being formed. We're kind of covering a really large timescale if we link them together, right? We can see what was happening 55 million years ago. And we can also see kind of the most recent 3 or 4 pulses that have been happening in the last, 20 million years. And by linking them all, we can see if this system has changed over time and how the plume overall has developed. You'll also see these nice blue triangles up here. So these are areas where drilling occurred on the IDP Expedition 395. So they took a nice drill ship out there. They collected actual rocks from down under there. So this way we can link our geophysical observations, our kind of remote sensing data on this with actual physical rock samples they've got and geochemistry that people can do on them. Now this happened quite literally last month we came back. I'm actually still wearing the t-shirt today. So we don't have results as such, right? We've got data, we haven't done much analysis of it. So instead, I'm going to show you, if it decides to play, this lovely video of some of the things we did. So this is the Marcus Langster. This is the science party. Oh gosh, it's going to be very loud. Hang on, let me mute that. Yes, we don't want that noise. These are our ocean bottom seismometers. So we deployed 152 of these little yellow friends. They have a metal anchor at the bottom. So we can just see there, when we release them, they sink down to the seafloor and they sit on the seabed and record seismic energy, sound energy as we shoot over them. These are all of them. It was a very crowded deck with so many of them. And as you can see, the conditions were perhaps not ideal to be doing this. So the North Atlantic in September, I would definitely say it's not a place to be if you get in any way seasick. But through a lot of work with some really dedicated people and taking a lot of time and care, we got it all done. And so once we give them a command, they release from the anchor, they come up, we throw a nice grappling hook, and then haul them back on board to get the data. We welcome them home with some lovely googly eyes. We also had a streamer. So this was 15 kilometers long. Yes, 15 kilometers of basically a cable on the back of our boat that we unwound. We spent actually days unwinding it. And it was steered by these instruments, which are known as digibirds, so they can control it and take it up and down. And over the top of this, we towed our seismic source. So this produced the sound energy that all of those instruments on the seafloor and the surface recorded. We also think it looks quite like Nessie, so we spent a lot of time recording it because it really looks like the Loch Ness Monster is following us. And also excitingly, we spent like a week sailing along the mid-ocean ridge. So it's really cool to have a different tectonic plate either side. And we also saw some absolutely fabulous volcanic features as we went over them. It was just amazing to watch. And some of them even erupted for us. This little hydrothermal vent, you can see that little bit go poof. That's a volcano erupting under the sea. And yeah, being at sea is just beautiful. When it wasn't raining, we had sunsets like this every day. We saw the northern lights. This is a really bad photo, but it looked stunning in the dark. We also managed to see the mythical green flash going on and get a nice picture of that. But mostly through an awful lot of hard work by a lot of people in this lab, we got some really amazing data sets. So we're all really excited about it. We spent an awfully long time collectively staring at all of it. And we're really excited to see what comes from this. So if you want to answer the question, is the Iceland plume still pulsing? Well, we'll let you know, right? But we have this project where we went out there aiming to test the thermal plume pulsing hypothesis for the modern day Iceland plume. And this is important, right? Because this is the hypothesis that is providing this physical mechanism that is allowing our simulated emissions from the igneous province to generate carbon fast enough to explain the PETM, right? This is the event that we can link them together and say one caused the other. And so with this, right, we collected a really fantastic seismic data set. Like, we are all very excited about the results from this, and we're very confident that it will allow us to achieve this aim. It's just obviously going to take us a few years to process all this data. We only came back last month, so there's a lot still to do. So we'll let you know at some point whether it's still pulsing. Keep an eye on it for stuff.
Thanks, Hazel. So thanks, Hazel, for this third and last chapter of our presentation. So now we can move to general conclusions to this talk. So we've seen the first chapter with the summary, can we find a record of the PETM magmatic pulse? And yes, we can. Can we characterize the PETM greenhouse gas emissions? It seems that yes, we can with melted fluid inclusions. And also, is the Iceland plume still pulsing? Well, this is still in progress, is still work in progress, but it seems so. So in general, we can say that yes, we can address these points with these different projects. But probably the main question that now everyone here is wondering is, but why we are so obsessed with the PETM? Why do we study global climate changes from the geological past as the PETM? Well, if you remember from my introduction, this was the last 65 million years timeline with the PETM, this big spike that represents the highest increase in temperature. And well, if we add one portion of this graph with the recent time and the future projections, be careful because here the time scale is very different. So from million of years, we are going to thousands of years. And then in the last part of the graph here, we are moving from the Industrial Revolution to the projection in the future up to the next 3 centuries. Well, we see that the projected increase in temperatures are very similar or even worse than the PETM. So this is the reason why we are studying PETM, because in the geological past, we've seen potentially similar events in terms of increase of temperature, but we didn't see nothing like what we are facing now in terms of timescales. The PETM we've seen occurred in 20,000 years, and similar increase in temperature are potentially happening in just a few centuries. And this is the reason why PETM is so important. And there are so many projects ongoing here in Birmingham, and not only focusing on the PETM and on the North Atlantic Igneous Province. Thank you all.